Dr. Patti Peeples, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. Today's guest is epidemiologist and computer scientist AI expert, Dr. Jeremy Rassen, co-founder and CEO of Aetion. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks so much for having me.
Jeremy, let's begin with a little look back of how you got here. Tell us a bit about your career trajectory.
Yeah. So you hinted at a lot of it in your introduction. So, as you mentioned, I studied computer science as an undergraduate, went out to Silicon Valley like people were doing those days. This was the Web 1.0 era. Worked in a number of companies, but in particular in a company called Epiphany, which was building very large scale, at least large scale at that time, databases that looked for how customers interacted with companies that they were purchasing from, and I found this very interesting. The amalgamation of the data, the analysis of the data, but really wanted to think about where that could be applied, kind of in a different field. And again, as you hinted, that began my trip back to the East Coast to study epidemiology, causal inference. And to think about how we could use this volume of data that we have in the medical world, starting back at the beginning when I was working with insurance claims and other kinds of data that were readily available, and use those data to understand not customer trends or kind of customer predictions of what a certain customer might do next. Are they going to cancel the magazine, keep the magazine, renew, whatever it might be, but rather, what might happen to a particular patient or a group of patients as they experienced a new medication. And this was a really fascinating topic because it brings in the data element, like I said, but also this element of causal inference. If I, as a patient, take this drug and experience this outcome, was it the drug that caused the outcome? And that's a really, really fundamental question. And to do that and to understand that and to evaluate that properly, you have to bring in this whole field of causal inference. Did X cause Y? And we all know the phrase, X is correlated with Y, but did it cause Y? I mean, it's exactly that. That kind of amalgamation of these two fields is what drove my thesis work initially, and then my faculty work at Harvard Medical School, thinking about in those days, mainly the safety of medications and whether we could demonstrate safety of medications in this thing that we now call real world data. Back then, we just called it observational data. And then eventually effectiveness of medications, value of medications, safety and effectiveness of non-drug treatments like medical devices, other kinds of interventions, and really kind of expanding out this field, but based on the same kind of set of fundamental techniques.
Was there a particular event or episode or a arena of drug development and drug launching that caught your eye and said, I think this kind of background can be useful?
When I was starting in this field, it was right around when Vioxx was in the news. And so that really was certainly an interesting case scientifically, but one that really kind of catalyzed the meaning of the field for me. That if we look at these data, and in our research group, we did look at data, we did look at Vioxx, and we were able to see the issues that were associated with Vioxx, like very clearly in the data, but only after we'd taken that whole kind of frame of knowledge that I mentioned, how to compute with the data, how to analyze the data, how to think about the question structurally so that we're getting an answer that makes sense to the question that we thought we had asked. That to me was a real kind of catalyzing moment of thinking about, I can see how it works. And in that case, the answer was we were demonstrating that it would work. But as we were doing that, I could say, oh, well, there's 100 more questions like this that we need evaluated. And hopefully the answer to all 100 of them is everything is safe. But I want to be able to demonstrate that through the data and through the analysis that we were doing.
Back then, we were essentially looking at data as, does it exist or not? Is it enough? Is it decent enough? And today, now we're talking about regulatory grade
Yeah.
versus publication grade or our internal decision-making grade. Do you think that there is a trend where regulatory grade may be beginning to be used a little bit loosely? And I'd like to understand how Aetion is operationalizing those terms. And when you answer this, what I'd really like to hear from you is how can you help our listeners who are purchasers and users of data know what questions to ask their data providers so they can really ascertain whether or not the data fit into those different buckets of regulatory versus publication versus internal decision-making grade?
Well, I think you said the key phrase there, which is, do the data fit the purpose that I'd like to use them for? And so if your intended use is to use the data for a regulatory interaction, I want to demonstrate to FDA that ... I want to demonstrate to EMA that ... You need the right data for it. If your intent is to get a quick understanding of a marketplace or get, an idea of how patients may use one drug and then the next drug and then, what their third line therapy might be, there's a whole different standard for what you need the data to be and what you need the data to do for you. But going to this notion of regulatory grade, that to me is probably the highest grade that you can think about using data for, the highest kind of context in which to put the data and then the results of the analysis that you're doing, which should be evidence, right? But evidence is only evidence if the person on the other side of it looks at it and says, yeah, this answered the question that I wanted, right? So for me, regulatory grade means we've developed the evidence in such a way that a regulator will say, I feel confident making the decision that I've been entrusted with based on the information that I've been provided. And, that's really developed over the years. I think we're in a really lovely spot right now where FDA has spent a number of years since 21st Century Cures through COVID, writing very clear guidances about what they expect out of the quality of the data, the presentation of the information, the conduct of the analysis, the submission of the results. And we have a very clear definition here in the United States of what regulatory expectation is. And I would say regulatory grade then means meeting regulatory expectation.
Yeah.
And that's changed somewhat over the years. But now we're in a very, very clear spot. Similarly, in other jurisdictions, in Europe, in Japan, in other parts of the world. And so I think we have a clear definition of regulatory grade. If we think about, publication grade or other kinds of grades, I don't think they're really different. I don't think you want to do an analysis less well for a publication than you would have for a regulator. It may mean that you need less documentation or less delving into very specific details that are really important in a regulatory context, but less so in, say, an academic journal. But I don't think these are hugely different at the end of the day.
What are one or two of those things that are different between publication and regulatory?
FDA might want to know, for a particular data element, the complete provenance of that data element. If this is my outcome and I'm saying I'm looking at heart attack or myocardial infarction as my outcome, I want to be able to trace through that data element that I'm relying on to say this patient did or did not have a myocardial infarction. An academic journal certainly cares about the definition of the outcome, the quality of the outcome, but it may suffice to say we tested it and it had a sensitivity of this and a specificity of that, whereas FDA may want to see more of the data behind that kind of summary that you're able to provide.
So there's been a little bit of criticism of late about Sentinel and FDA's shifting stance on real world data. Certainly, as you have noted, there has been a great progress in defining what those data need to look like. But do you feel like in any way that we have overreached in the real world data arena? And if so, where? I'm thinking specifically about maybe the acceptance of using some types of employer data that may not sufficiently represent the population.
So, I mean, when you say we and we have overreached, I think there has been some overreaching, but I don't think I personally have done it. I don't think my company's done it. My colleagues have done it.
Mhm.
I think there are places where people have asked the data to do things that they wittingly or not weren't aware that the data could not do.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if that's overreach, but it's sort of misapplication of the data.
Mhm.
And for me, a very important first question is, this is what I'm trying to solve. These are the data I have. Do these data solve this question? And
Mhm.
if they don't, can I make them better so that they do? And if they do, how do I demonstrate that? And so that to me is keeps you in bounds, right? So you're not overreaching. You're really getting something appropriate from the raw material, the data that you have. There have certainly been cases of evidence that wasn't really evidence. Now, is that overreach? I don't really know, but there was the famous case of some fraudulent data being used in a prominent publication, right? That's fraud. I don't think that's overreach. I would call that fraud. So I think being very, very thoughtful about what's the question I have, what data are available to answer that question, and do the data answer the question, that keeps you from overreaching. And if the answer to that is no, and I can't improve the data and I can't do any of those things we just talked about, is there a question I can answer that sheds some light on the issue, that gets me some part of the way, that gets to some level of understanding? Because ultimately we're doing this because clinicians need to make decisions, regulators need to make decisions, patients need to understand the impact on their health. And it's our responsibility to do this well, and it's our responsibility to create as much information as we can that we can really depend on.
So you said something that caught my ear. How can I make these data better?
Right.
I had a really great conversation with Laura Pizzia of ISPOR that was talking about the future of where ISPOR is looking, which is to really go well beyond the typical health ecosystems data sets to improve, sort of what the value flower, if you will, is looking at all of the different ways of valuing. And so they're looking at other non-medical data sources that really give some insight into the trajectory of patient health. What's Aetion doing in this arena, if anything?
Well, I think one of the ways you can make data better is, well, let me take a step back. One of the things that makes a data set potentially not applicable to a study is you don't have all the information you need. And that could be very obvious. There could be a column in your data that says ejection fraction, and it's not filled in all the way through, and you're trying to study heart failure.
Yeah.
It's going to be very difficult, right? For me, the more subtle case and the more interesting case to think about is, were the data just not captured, and I'm not seeing it, not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't captured, or was captured somewhere else. And for me, that's kind of the negative space in the data. I look at a data set, I can see all the things that I have, right? But I have to imagine the things that I don't. And real world data comes from the real world. I mean, it's an apt term, sometimes a little hard to say, but it's an apt term. And real world situations have to be thought about. So if I'm looking at insurance data, this was captured for the reason and the purpose of billing. Like, what am I going to see in a billing database versus what may not be captured there? So over-the-counter drugs, those don't get billed to an insurance company. I'm not going to see that. So if that's key to my study, I'm doing a study that requires understanding patients' use of aspirin as a preventive for cardiac disease. That may not be ideal. If I'm looking at an electronic medical record, but it's from one hospital and that's a tertiary care facility, but I know that the patient has gone through a long journey to get to that place, literally that place, that hospital, what am I not seeing about the journey that brought them to that place? And what do I need to understand about that journey in order to really evaluate the question? So that's sort of the negative space. And so if that's the issue, one of the things that one can do is certainly bring in more data. I need to link in more data. And we have some very powerful techniques that have emerged over the last couple of years in terms of data tokenization, where I can tokenize data sets and do that in a way that fully protects patients' privacy, and then bring those data sets together. And as I brought them together, I can again verify that I'm operating within the bounds of HIPAA and other privacy regulations, to really understand the question more completely, but do it in the way that fully respects the patients who are contributing the information. And as we think about other kinds of data that we bring in, maybe consumer data or whatever it might be, that's the frame in which to think about it, which is, can I enrich the data in a way that makes my answer to the question better evidence for the person who needs to consume it and make the decision from it, and do it in a way that's fully in line with both regulation, of course, but also respectful of patients' privacy.
What areas of data are you adding into your traditional medical and pharmaceutical data sets that are, let's say, on the standard periphery of what we typically do?
I'd say, a lot of what we're doing is filling in the timeline. And so if we know that, back to this notion of a patient journey, because it really is a journey, if we're looking at a third line treatment, do we have a full understanding of what first and second line were and what the patient's experience with those was? So it's often bringing more data, maybe even similar data to the table, but to give you that longer term picture, because almost everything we do in epidemiology is longitudinal. It's a longitudinal analysis. We need to understand time. And so if you don't have all the elements of the timeline, it's very hard to get that longitudinal view. So that I would say is the most common thing we're doing. That's kind of expanding information, kind of deepening the information is something that we'd also do, where, the example I gave of ejection fraction, if I only have it in half my patients, how do I get it in the other half? Or how do I fill that in? And that can come from a number of different places. If over the counter is the question, maybe some data from front of house at a pharmacy or whatnot may be helpful, but again, it has to be done in a way that we understand that the aspirin that somebody bought at the store was for them and was for this purpose, and and that's a difficult thing to do. And B, that we're really kind of very respectful of what patients are expecting of us in terms of the very, very careful way in which we treat their data and respect their privacy.
How are you leaning into your background in artificial intelligence in these activities associated with data analytics?
I mean, that's an interesting question. It is in many ways the question right now. Maybe I'm mundane in some ways, but I look at artificial intelligence as an incredible technology that gets us somewhere, right? And as with any technology, our job is to look at it and say, where can this tech take us? And what can it do for us that I can't do now, or that I can do now, but it takes me a long time, or it's very laborious, or whatever it might be. And so, when we founded Aetion 12 years ago at this point, we had a very similar notion, which was Amazon and cloud services were emerging. These are brand new technologies. The interacting with applications through web browsers had emerged. That was a relatively new technology. How can we take these technologies and apply them to this question of generating more and better real world evidence? And we did that, right? We were able to put data in a secure way in the cloud, throw a lot of compute at it to analyze it very quickly, really kind of make something that was a very manual process much more tech enabled. And I look at AI and what AI can do for us, and that expands, literally every week, as another kind of layer of that, which is, what can this technology do for us that makes this problem easier and better and faster, so that we can create more evidence, because that's what decision makers need. And so if it can help us with something simple like a lit review, great, let's use it. If it can help us with something a little more complex like a study design, great, let's use it. And the list goes on, right? But ultimately, I see it as an enabling technology for us as humans to do our jobs better. And I don't think we're in a place right now where we can hand the keys over to AI and say, okay, you do it. You answer the question for me. For a couple of reasons, technical reasons, like, how do I know what was done? How do I kind of follow its quote unquote thinking process, right? But also, you know, I don't want to overstate it, but sort of ethical reasons as well, which is if this evidence is going to affect patients' healthcare, like I want to really understand it. I really want to know how it was done, what was done. I want to make it very transparent. I want anybody to be able to reproduce it. And we're not in a place yet, I don't think, with AI technologies to make that possible. Mm-hmm. But, ultimately, especially in our field, we carry a burden and a responsibility. And I take that very seriously because patients' lives are being affected by the evidence that we create. And I always, always, always want myself, everyone I work with to keep that in mind.
Do you have an AI sandbox that you play in where you dream, or you do you feel like your strong moral center on ensuring credibility and validity of data maybe makes you a little slower on the uptake of this?
No, we have a sandbox and we dream a lot, and we dream about a lot of different things. We dream about how can our applications be made better through AI? How can a user experience be made faster or easier? How can the data processing be made more quick, more efficient? How can the reporting be made more transparent? How can the documentation be understandable at every level, from the simplest kind of executive summary all the way through someone who wants to look at 300 pages of documentation that our system creates. And so we're always testing out, can I make this evidence faster and better and more reliable through these techniques? And so we have a very active AI sandbox being played in by some incredibly thoughtful, incredibly intelligent colleagues who can really kind of test these ideas and see which stand up to that kind of, again, sort of, I don't want to overstate it, but sort of that ethical standard we talk about, while also making it better for our users and making it better for people who are consuming this information. So we're all in. It's just, we want to understand what it's doing.
We apply. So this is sort of a practical question. Where are you presenting these data on your experiments with this? Are you presenting them in traditional HEOR environments? Are you going to tech AI data analytics conferences? Where can we learn more about your progress on that?
We're doing a lot with our customers. Our customers are very, very interested in this as well. So we're working closely with our customers, and they often may see the first fruits of this labor, right? And it could be in our application as they're experiencing a kind of a new user experience that's AI enabled, but it could also be the result of a summary of a very large report that we've created. We don't tend to sort of publish these in sort of the traditional ways. I think there's a lot of work in academia that we're able to read and learn from and build upon, but we don't tend to publish it back out. As we're talking at conferences, it's not a secret, right? What we're doing, we like to talk about it. We like to kind of bounce ideas off colleagues and such. But I would say it doesn't take sort of the traditional kind of publication route that a method study or other kind of study might take.
So there's a little bit of, let's go back to real world evidence. There's a bit of scrutiny that is I think growing around the commercial influence in real world evidence generation. Do you see any role for public interest audits or independent replications or open protocols with platforms like Aetion has?
I mean, it's a little bit at the heart of what we do. And when we started developing this technology, we said that, real world evidence, again, in order to be evidence, it has to be accepted by the party that you're sending it to. And if someone's going to look at it and say, I can't do anything with this. I don't have enough information about where it came from or why it's here or what it's doing in order to do something with it. And so we built from the bottom up in the technology transparency. So we want, at the very kind of beginning levels, we want to do as little as possible with the data that we receive so that anything that is done with the data as part of the study can become part of the study documentation. And again, we see this reflected in some of the guidelines. Tell us all the transformations you did on the data. The data don't come kind of stamped with the answers. You have to kind of, algorithmically kind of get the answers out of the data, but being able to describe that algorithm, we see as really, really important. And if you've described it all well and you've documented it and you've made sure that there's no daylight between what you wrote down and what you did, and technology allows us to do this, right? Because technology can say, this is what I did, and here's an English language version of that, and it's going to be one-to-one all the way through. That's different than, say, a protocol that someone picks up, works on the protocol, delivers results. You hope that it's very, very similar, and it probably is very, very similar, but there is that possibility that what was written down and what was done are different in a small way or a large way. But if we're able to create that, and we are with technology, such that there's no daylight between what you said you did and what you actually did, and that is comprehensive, then that also becomes the basis for reproducing the study. So if someone wants to pick up what you did and reproduce it in the same data or in different data, they're fully enabled to do that. And so we started with that philosophy at the very beginning. Every study that we run creates a PDF, a Word document that's a couple hundred pages long. It says, this is what was done. And that's exactly why we did that, because it's not evidence if someone's not accepting it.
So tell me and our listeners a little more about your Aetion Substantiate platform, because a big component of that is of course transparency and reproducibility. So explain it to us.
Yeah, I mean, it really encapsulates a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about. So as you want to sit down and create something that's regulatory grade, and we talked about what that meant, but could also be publication grade, anything from which you think a very substantial decision may be made from. Substantiate enables that workflow, guardrails that workflow, and make sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed all the way through. So it's our first software product. We have others available as well, but our first software product that takes sort of the mind and the thinking of an epidemiologist and says, this is the process by which I would do this study, encodes that into technology, allows the user to go through that step by step, make sure that there's the right guardrails along the way. An important thing is to make sure that you're not sort of peeking at the answer ahead of time. You want to do this kind of fresh from a protocol, on the protocol all the way through. Get your answer and say, okay, this is my answer. All those guardrails are built into the application, and then making sure at the end that what was done was transparent. It's clearly documented. It's reproducible. It's archived. So if you ever need to come back to it, it's there. And that anybody who wants to follow that process has enough information in order to do that, even either in Substantiate, if they have their own copy of that, or in some other piece of software. And again, this is really core to the science that underlies all of these analytics that we do.
So you alluded to this. You mentioned guardrails, and you mentioned not being able to kind of peek at what you want your answer to be or could be. So that gets right to the heart of how financial incentives may negatively influence our work product. Be specific and help me understand exactly how you've tried to address that issue of not letting financial incentives affect your work product.
Well, let me ask you a question back. So how would a financial incentive affect a work product in theory here?
There may be a desire for a certain positive outcome for the analysis.
Yeah. I think, you can always pick up a data set and analyze it and look for the outcome that you're looking for, right? And that's not recommended practice. It's not good practice. It's the thing that we really seek to avoid. But if we're being very frank about it, right, you can pick up an analytics program like R or SAS or whatnot and ask the data questions.
Sure.
There may be a record of that there may not. What our system does is create what I call the denominator, which is, this is the answer I gave. That's my numerator. These are all the variations I tried. That's my denominator.
Got it.
And so can you try different variations in our software? Sure.
Mhm.
But that archiving, that record, that transparency applies equally well to the answer, as well as all the other things that were tried along the way. And to me, that's the best way to avoid or kind of at least understand what was done along the way, to avoid any questions about whether the answer was fished for, or kind of engineered in some other way.
Thank you. That really helps me understand. It basically documents the fishing expeditions that are.
It documents the process, and if that process,
includes fishing,
went off course, that gets documented too.
We certainly have some events that are happening in Washington, D.C. as it relates to data access. I was thinking this morning that it's sort of like that old Pete Seeger song, "Where have all the flowers gone? Where have all the data gone?" Are you having conversations inside Aetion about how these missing data may affect your work, the validity of what you do? Are you doing any plan Bs of, if these data are no longer available, we will go down this route? Talk a little bit about
some
that.
of the public data sets that may not be updated as frequently, or may not have all the information that they did at some point in the past. We tend to use some of those data sets as guides to where we might need to evaluate, say, a safety signal or other kind of question. But ultimately, we're doing our own analyses from kind of base data, the vast majority of the time. So, while I think these are incredibly important data sets, and I hope we're back at a place soon where they're widely available, quickly updated, I think that's important. It doesn't tend to affect our day-to-day so much, at least not at this point. But I think these are important public health assets that we need.
Let's talk a little bit about how you lead and what influences have come to you that have helped create how you lead your people at Aetion, and what type of role you play in our industry overall. What philosophical or scientific thinkers have shaped your thinking, shaped the way you think about evidence, decision making, and leading?
That's a good question. So our name Aetion comes from the Greek word for causality, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by getting the Greek wrong or upsetting any classicists who might be watching this. But ultimately, that's an Aristotelian idea, if I'm not mistaken. This notion of cause and effect, I think, went back to some of the original philosophers. Now, do I wake up every morning thinking about Aristotle? No. For me, that the core of the philosophy that kind of enables us every day is, where does technology meet science? And so it's not kind of one line of thinking, but to me, it's, how do I bring these lines of thinking together to create the goal here, which is better evidence more quickly, addressing more questions, and getting a better understanding of the safety, effectiveness, and value of medications and other therapies. I can say that slower, but to me, that's very core. So I say it very quickly. And so it's not sort of one philosophy or one philosopher, but rather, how do I bring these fields together in the most thoughtful way? So how do I take technology and make it really work for the science? And this goes back to the AI question a little bit. How do I take AI and make it work in service of the science? And then how do I take the science and sort of boil it down to a process that can really be aided by technology, right? So it comes from both sides. So I can't sort of attach specific philosophers' names to that, but to me, that's the philosophy by which we operate, and really, it's that constant balance of, how can I make the science better through technology, and how can the science be conceived of in a way that technology can really help it.
Let's go to our lightning round.
Oh boy.
What problem or challenge keeps you up at night?
what keeps me up at night is the same thing that gets me up in the morning, which is ultimately we're doing important work and we need to get it right. And so the idea that, we may have done something in a way that affects someone's health in a negative way keeps me up at night. Now, it hasn't happened. And, we're very careful, and the science really guides us. So, it shouldn't happen and likely won't happen, right? But that responsibility keeps me up at night, and I think that's healthy. But like I said, it's also the thing that gets me up in the morning. Like, how can we use the information we have to make to enable better health decisions at all levels, so that we have a healthier community around us? Like, that's what I love too.
Mm-hmm. Is there a particular health problem, health challenge that you would love to solve if you could?
I think GLP-1 drugs are fascinating. I think they are really, really fascinating. And I'm an amateur here in terms of the science of how they work and the physiology. But just everything you read about the clinical trials that are being done, the different outcomes that seem to be benefited by GLP-1s, I think is going to be the story of the next, call it 10 years. And so I think a lot about where can real world data and real world evidence support understanding of the effects of these medications, because I think there's a lot to learn, probably much more to learn than we're able to learn kind of feasibly through clinical trials. And I think scientifically it's fascinating, and I can't think of another intervention in the last number of years that could have that great an impact on that number of people. I mean, clearly there have been some incredibly important therapies developed in the last, 10, 20 years, immunotherapy, the list goes on and on, but this I see as just a really interesting moment in our health and our healthcare.
Mm-hmm. What should our industry, and our industry being HEOR, real world evidence, market access, what should our industry be doing more of and less of?
Well, more real world evidence.
Really?
Okay. I think it's a very powerful tool to really understand, again, safety, effectiveness, and value. And those are kind of three legs of the same stool, in my opinion. And I really think from the very kind of, I don't want to call it simple, because they're not simple. They're often complex, but for the very kind of first questions, like what is the treatment pattern? What is the journey in this particular therapeutic area that patients experience, and how can we make that better? Where can we change that? And then if we did make that change, what would the benefit be? These are all questions that we can answer very readily with real world data and real world evidence by getting the right data, asking the right questions, and taking it all the way through to the very end steps there. So that to me is something that we could do more of. What should we do less of? I struggle there. I don't want to do fewer randomized trials. The more the better, the more the merrier, right? But counting exclusively on randomized trials for evidence is something that we should probably be doing less of these days. There was a weekend a couple years ago where I went and I studied up a little bit on the history of the randomized trial, kind of conceived perhaps in the 1950s, kind of adopted over a number of years. There was a New England Journal article from, I want to say 1980, 1981, looking at decisions that FDA was making and what kind of evidence they were making those decisions on. And I'm doing this approximately, but it was like a third, maybe, or 40% at that time were being based on randomized trials. This is the early 1980s. And a lot were being based on historical controls or other kinds of techniques. That was a 30-year progression, right? And I think we're at that same moment with real world data and real world evidence. So it's not fewer trials, but it's a broader view on how we can create and understand evidence. And so, the thing I would do less of is indexing on a single gold standard, often thought of as the clinical trial, and thinking instead about sort of the variety of gold standards that helps me answer the question that's in front of me. And in particular, I'd say real world data and real world evidence give information that you can't get from a clinical trial about real world treatments and how they work and whom they work for, in a broader sense than you're ever going to be able to test in a trial. And I think that's something that's incredibly important, and not considering that holistically is something that we should do less.
Mm-hmm. If we're talking in 10 years, what are we going to be talking about?
We're probably still going to be talking about AI for sure. But I think we'll have a better historical perspective at that point around real world data and real world evidence. And as I said, I think we're at this moment, right, where so much more evidence will be based, at least in part, on real world information. And maybe that's real world evidence kind of on its own. Maybe it's somehow linked into a clinical trial framework, whatever it might be. I think we're at this moment where this is taking off. And for me, the catalyst in some ways was COVID and our experience with COVID, and having that acute need to understand effectiveness of different therapies for a pandemic that was all around us and showed kind of no signs of leaving us. I think that catalyzed this field in a large way, and showed what could be done. And now I think, we're a couple years past that. Thankfully, we're seeing it being done. And I think 10 years from now, we're going to see, the kind of full trajectory of real world data and real world evidence into its spot in the evidence stack, and where it sits alongside trials or with trials or other kinds of evidence that are out there.
So picking up on that, what problem would you solve if you had unlimited financial time and other resources? And be specific here. I suspect you would say more data sources, better quality data sources, but give me something specific that you would like to really understand and solve.
Well, so I'm a computer science undergraduate. So when I hear unlimited data resources, like, okay, well, I can go really big here, because unlimited, it's truly unlimited. So, world peace, climate change, all of those things, right? But specifically in our field, I'd want to solve a data question, because everything that I do in the generation of real world evidence relies on the existence and quality of real world data. And so I'd want to think about how can we restructure our data capture in a way that is complete, is longitudinal, is detailed in all the right ways, is kind of linkable from institution to institution, and do that within our, somewhat messy healthcare system here in the United States. And, if you go to the Nordics, Denmark, Sweden, you have this very kind of holistic view of data. I'd love to have that here in the United States, and in other parts of the world, because what you can do with that is fairly limitless. And so you can do that through a structural change, like standards or kind of common formats. You can also do that through a technical application, like being able to sort of say, okay, this is what exists. I'm going to take my resources and apply it to kind of making something better from what's here. And that's where I see a lot of the technology today going. And I think that's very, very helpful.
Mm-hmm. And the last one is sort of a silly question. What are you currently binge watching?
What am I currently binge watching? I have on my queue the latest season of Hacks, because that's important.
It's important.
Fantastic. I have been watching a lot of Righteous Gemstones. And
hilarious.
What We Do in the Shadows. I don't binge watch it, because you need to have it a little bit at a time. I think too much, you can go too heavy on that. But always good for a chuckle or a laugh or beyond. And then Arrested Development's always there in the background to
Always a solid. Well, there you have it, folks. Jeremy, I want to thank you. This has been illuminating and just as thought-provoking as I thought it might be. I appreciate your time.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Patti.
It's a pleasure.